William Hayes dropped the reins the moment Amelia Carter stepped down from the stagecoach, and every man on the boardwalk went quiet. He looked at her, all of her, and turned his back. "There's been a mistake," he said loud enough for the whole town of Cold Creek to hear. Behind him, somebody laughed. Amelia stood alone in the Montana dust, 300 miles from anything she'd ever known, clutching a letter that promised her a home. And the man who had sent for her couldn't even bring himself to look her in the eye. Before we go on, if you love stories about the women the world tried to throw away, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far Amelia's story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The laughter didn't stop with one man. It rolled down the boardwalk like a bottle kicked into a gutter, picked up by a second man, then a third, until the whole front of the mercantile was grinning at her. Amelia Carter kept her chin level. She'd learned a long time ago that if you flinched, they only laughed harder. So she stood there in the noon heat with her carpet bag in one hand and that folded letter in the other, and she did not flinch. "Told you, Hayes," the man by the water trough called out. "You order a wife by mail, you get whatever they got left over." "Ain't that the truth?" another one said. "Reckon they sent you 2 women in 1 crate." That got the loudest laugh yet. Amelia felt the heat climb up her neck, but she looked past all of them at the man's back. He was tall, sun-worn still as a fence post, and he hadn't turned around again. His shoulders were tight up around his ears like a man bracing for a blow. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He didn't move. "Mr. William Hayes," she said again louder, and she was surprised her voice came out so steady. "I have a letter here with your name on it. Your hand unless somebody's forged it. So I'd be obliged if you'd turn around and tell me to my face. There's been a mistake instead of telling my backside." The boardwalk went dead quiet. Slowly, William Hayes turned. He was younger than she'd pictured, maybe 35, with a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 days, and eyes the gray color of a winter sky right before it decides to storm. Grief had gotten into that face somewhere and never fully left. She saw it right off. She'd seen it in the mirror often enough herself. "Ma'am," he said, and he took his hat off, which surprised her. "I don't rightly know what to say to you." "You could start with the truth," Amelia said. He turned the hat brim in his hands. "The truth is, I wrote a letter to an agency in St. Louis, months back, in a bad hour." His voice dropped. "I got 6 boys and no wife, ma'am, and a house I can't keep running, and I put pen to paper one night when I should have been sleeping. Then I came to my senses and I told myself no woman in her right mind would answer it." He looked up. "And here you are." "Here I am." "I never sent the money for a ticket." Amelia's grip tightened on the carpet bag. "The agency sent it. Told me a family in Montana was waiting on me. Told me there were children who needed a mother." She heard her own voice crack on the last word and hated it. "I sold what I had left in Missouri, Mr. Hayes. I buried my own mother in April, and I had no one, and a woman came to my door and said there was a widower in the West who needed a wife and would treat her decent." She lifted the letter. "This is what I've got left in the whole world. This letter and that bag. So no, there has not been a mistake. There has been a coward." Somebody on the boardwalk drew a breath through his teeth. William Hayes stood there and took it. He didn't argue. That was the first thing she'd learn about him, though she didn't know it yet, that when a thing was true, he wouldn't fight it, no matter how bad it stung. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I got no way to marry a woman I can't feed proper. My ranch is failing. My wife's been dead 3 winters, and my boys don't hardly speak. I did you a wrong sending that letter, and I'll do you a bigger wrong if I take you out to that place and can't make good." He put his hat back on. "There's a boarding house down the street. I'll pay your fare back to Missouri myself. It's the least a man can do." "I've got nothing to go back to," Amelia said. "You've got nothing to come to either," he said. That's the God's honest truth of it. And for a moment, they just stood there, The two of them in the middle of the street with the whole town watching and neither one knowing what came next. Then a boy's voice said, "Pa." Amelia looked, and William Hayes flinched like he'd been caught. There was a wagon pulled up in the shade beside the mercantile. She hadn't noticed it before. And in that wagon sat 6 boys. They were stair-stepped in age, the tallest maybe 16, the smallest so little he could barely see over the buckboard. Every one of them was thin. Not sick thin, but the thin of children who ate what there was and never quite enough. Their clothes were clean, but mended so many times the men's had mends. And they were all 6 of them staring at her with the same careful, guarded look, the look of children who had learned early that hoping for something was the fastest way to lose it. "Pa," the tall one said again. "Is that her?" William's jaw worked. "James, you stay in the wagon." But the tall boy James had already climbed down. He walked over slow, and he stopped a few feet from Amelia and looked her up and down the same way his father had, except there was no cruelty in it. Just weighing. Just measuring. "You the woman from the letter?" James asked. "I am," Amelia said. "Pa said you weren't coming." "Your pa was wrong." James glanced back at his father, then at her. "You know how to cook?" The question came out flat, almost hard, but underneath it Amelia heard something else, something so raw and hungry it near about knocked the wind out of her. She'd heard grown men ask for salvation with less need in their voices than that boy asking if she could cook. "I do," she said gently. "I surely do." James nodded once like he'd settled something in his own mind. Then he turned to his father. "We're low on flour," he said. "And Samuel burned the beans again last night. Whole pot. We ain't got but 2 more days of anything." He said it plain like a man giving a report. And that was the worst part, that a boy this young had the whole weight of feeding a family sitting on him and had learned to carry it without complaint. William Hayes closed his eyes. "James, you said find a wife, Pa, in the letter. I read it before you sent it." James's voice didn't rise, but it shook a little. "You said the boys need a mother and I need help and I can't do it alone no more. I read every word." He looked at Amelia. "So she can't go back. We need her." The men on the boardwalk had gone quiet again, and this was a different kind of quiet. Amelia stood there with her heart cracking clean down the middle for a boy she'd known for 90 seconds. "Son," William said, and his voice was ragged now. "I can't promise her." "You don't gotta promise nothing," Amelia said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She set her carpetbag down in the dust and walked over to the wagon, and she looked at those 6 thin, careful faces, one at a time. The little one at the far end shrank back against the seat. The 2 in the middle, near of an age both dark-haired, watchful, as barn cats, didn't move a muscle. And the smallest of all, a boy, no more than 5, with a bandage wrapped clumsy around one hand, just stared at her with enormous eyes. "What happened to your hand?" Amelia asked him. The little one didn't answer. He pulled the hand behind his back. "That's Samuel," James said. "He burned it on the pot. Doing the cookin'." The way he said it, Amelia could tell he blamed himself and only himself for a 5-year-old getting burned at a stove. "May I see it, Samuel?" Amelia asked. The little boy shook his head hard. "That's all right," she said. "You don't have to. But I'll tell you something. Where I come from, a burn like that means you're brave. You know that. Means you stood at a hot stove and tried to feed folks even when it hurt. That's a brave thing. That's a grown man's thing, and you're doing it at 5. She smiled at him. "I never met anybody that brave. Not once in my whole life." Samuel's chin trembled. Slowly, without a word, he brought the little bandaged hand out from behind his back and held it up for her to see. Amelia took it gentle as a bird's egg. The bandage was filthy, and the wrapping had come loose. Whoever had done it hadn't known how, and it was going to fester if it wasn't seen to. "This needs cleaning proper," she said more to herself than anyone. Then she looked up at William Hayes, who was standing behind her now, and she saw that whatever hard thing he'd been holding on to had come loose in his chest. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I don't need promises. I don't need a fine house. I buried everyone I had, and I've been alone a long while, and I think maybe you know something about that." She held Samuel's little hand a moment longer. "But I will not stand here in the street and argue with you while this baby's hand is going bad. So you can send me back to Missouri if that's your final word. But if there's any part of you that hasn't given up all the way, then you'll let me ride out to that ranch and dress this child's hand and put a hot supper on your table tonight, and we can settle the rest tomorrow when nobody's hungry." For a long moment, William Hayes didn't say anything at all. The town watched. His sons watched. Then he bent down, picked up her carpet bag out of the dust, and held it against his chest. "There's flour needs buying first," he said rough. "And I don't have much money, Miss Carter. I want you to know that going in." "I've fed a whole church supper on a nickel and a prayer," Amelia said. "Flour I can work with." Something moved at the corner of William's mouth. It wasn't a smile. He was 3 winters out of practice at smiling. But it was the ghost of where one used to live. "James," he said, "help Miss Carter up front." James was already there with his hand out. The men on the boardwalk had nothing to say now. One of them, the one who'd made the crate joke, took his hat off, quiet, and looked at his boots. Amelia climbed up into the wagon, and it took some doing, and she felt every eye on her while she did it, and she did not care one particle. She settled onto the seat, and the little ones scooted to make room without being asked, and that was its own small miracle, though nobody remarked on it. They bought flour and cornmeal and a little side of salt pork, and William counted out his coins onto the counter with the care of a man counting out his own blood. Amelia saw how few there were. She saw the storekeeper's wife give her that look, the up-and-down look, the mouth pinched tight, and she heard the woman murmur to her husband as they went out, "Well, she'll eat them out of house and home, that's certain." James heard it too. His whole body went stiff. "Don't," Amelia said quiet, laying a hand on his shoulder before he could turn around. "Don't ever let a small person make you small. You hear me?" James looked at her, and for 1 second, just one, the hardness in his young face cracked, and she saw the frightened, exhausted, grieving child underneath it, the boy who'd been playing at being a man since he was 13 because there wasn't anybody else to do it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The ranch was an hour out, and William drove it mostly in silence. Amelia didn't push him. She'd learned that too, that grief in a man was like a spooked horse, and you didn't run at it hollering. You stood still and let it come to you. So she rode beside him with Samuel drowsing against her arm, and the other boys tucked in the wagon bed behind, and she let the silence be. It was the middle boy who broke it, one of the 2 watchful, dark-haired ones. "Ma'am," he said from the back. "You can call me Amelia if you like," she said, turning. "Which one are you?" "Ethan," he said. "That's Caleb." He jerked a thumb at his near twin beside him. "We're a year apart, but folks always think we're twins." "I can see why," Amelia said. "You've both got that look like you're figuring whether a body can be trusted." The 2 of them went still. "That's smart," Amelia said before either could get defensive. "That's real smart, watching folks before you trust them. Means somebody taught you the hard way that not everybody's kind." She turned back around. "You keep watching me, Ethan. You watch me good. I'll wait." She felt the 2 boys exchange a look behind her, and she felt something in the wagon loosen just the smallest bit. The ranch, when they came over the last rise, was worse than she'd braced for. The house leaned. The barn had lost half its roof to some old storm, and nobody'd found the heart to fix it. The garden was gone to weeds. A few thin cattle stood in a pen that needed mending. It was the picture of a place where the man of it had quit not on the work exactly, but on the reason for the work. A man kept a place up for the people in it. A man who'd stopped believing there were people worth keeping it for, just let it fall. Amelia didn't say a word about any of it. "Nice big sky out here," is all she said, and she meant it because it was, and because sometimes the only kind thing you can do is find the one thing that's true and beautiful, and say that instead. Inside the house was cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather. She'd been in poor houses her whole life. Poor didn't scare her. But this was something worse than poor. There was no sign anywhere that anybody lived here on purpose. The children's things were stacked in corners like they were ashamed to take up room. There were no pictures on the walls except one turned face down on the mantel, and Amelia understood without asking whose likeness it was and why it had been laid down. The kitchen was the worst of it. The stove was caked. The table had one chair pulled to it and the rest shoved against the wall, and she understood that too, that these 7 people had stopped sitting down together, that they'd been eating standing up, and hurried and alone each one of them for 3 long years. She took off her traveling coat and hung it on a peg like she'd lived there 100 years. "James," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Fetch me clean water and a clean cloth. Ethan, Caleb, I need that stove blacked and lit. Samuel." She crouched down to the littlest one. "You're my special helper. You're going to sit right here at this table and hold this bowl for me and not let it move, and that's the most important job of all. Can you do that?" Samuel nodded, solemn as a judge. "You," she said, turning to the one boy she hadn't named yet. A slight, quiet child of maybe 10, who'd hung back this whole time, half hid behind his brothers. "What's your name, honey?" "Danny," he whispered. "Danny, you're going to help me measure the flour. You good with your hands?" Danny nodded barely. "Then you're hired," Amelia said, and just like that, she had them. Not their hearts that would take longer, but their hands, their attention, a purpose to stand up straight for. She set them all to moving, and the cold kitchen filled up with the sounds a kitchen ought to make. William stood in the doorway the whole while and watched his children move around this stranger like iron filings around a lodestone, and something on his face Amelia couldn't read. She dressed Samuel's hand first before anything else, cleaned it proper, the boy biting his lip and not crying, and wrapped it fresh. "There," she said. "Now it can heal." "Does it?" Samuel started, then stopped. "Does it what, sugar? Does it mean I don't gotta cook no more?" he asked, so quiet she almost missed it. "'Cause I'm not good at it. James yells when I burn it, but I try real hard." And his whole little face was so earnest and so afraid that Amelia had to look away for a second and blink hard at the wall. "No baby," she said when she could talk again. "You don't ever have to cook again unless you want to. Cooking's my job now. Yours is just to be 5. She smoothed his hair. "You've been carrying a grown-up job on your little shoulders, and I'm here to take it off you now." "All right." Samuel looked at her like she'd handed him the moon. "All right," he whispered. Behind her in the doorway, William Hayes made a low sound in his throat and turned and walked out toward the barn. The supper was not fancy. Fresh bread because she'd started the dough the second they got there. Beans done right this time, slow and seasoned. The salt pork stretched with whatever wild greens Danny knew where to find, because it turned out the quiet one knew every plant on that property. A little cornbread, nothing that would have turned a head in a St. Louis dining room. But the smell of it filled that dead house up like water filling a dry well. The boys kept drifting back to the kitchen. They couldn't help it. They'd sniff the air and find some reason to be near, and Amelia never once shooed them off. She let them hover. She handed Ethan a heel of warm bread, just to taste, and watched him close his eyes when he bit it, watched the tough, watchful older boy's whole face go soft and young. She caught Caleb sneaking one for himself and pretended she hadn't. She let Danny stir the beans and told him he was a natural. When it was near ready, she looked around at the 7 mismatched chairs shoved against the walls. "James," she said, "help me set these chairs to the table, all of them." James went still. "We don't—" He stopped. "We don't all sit at once, ma'am. We ain't done that in—" He couldn't finish it. "I know," Amelia said, gentle. "But we're going to tonight." She started pulling chairs to the table herself, and after a second, James came and helped, and then all of them were doing it, dragging chairs across the floor. 7 chairs for 7 people, more chairs at that table than had been at it in 3 years. Then Amelia went to the door and looked out toward the barn where William Hayes had gone to hide, and she saw him standing there in the last of the light, not working, just standing his back to the house because he couldn't stand to look at it full of the very thing he'd lost. She didn't call out to him. She sent Samuel. The little boy trotted across the yard with his fresh bandaged hand held careful against his chest, and Amelia watched him tug at his father's sleeve. And she watched William Hayes look down at his youngest, and she watched the boy say something she never did learn exactly what, and she watched that hard, grieving, giving-up man take his little son's good hand and let himself be led back toward the house like it was the boy leading him out of somewhere dark. They came in together, and William Hayes stopped dead in the doorway of his own kitchen. His 6 sons were sitting at the table. All of them. Washed-up hair pushed down with water, sitting up straight in 7 chairs with steam rising off the food and the lamp lit and the smell of fresh bread thick in the air. James at the head where a boy his age had no business having to sit. Ethan and Caleb side by side. Danny with his quiet, careful hands folded. And an empty chair. One empty chair pulled up to the head of the table across from James. His chair. The place he hadn't sat in 3 years. William Hayes stood in that doorway, and Amelia watched 3 winters of frozen grief hit a wall of warm bread and lamplight and children's faces, and she watched the wall of it start to give. "Miss Carter," he said, and his voice wasn't working right. "I told you, I don't have anything to give a wife. I got nothing." Amelia set the last dish on the table. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I've been looked at like I was nothing my whole life. Folks took one glance at me and decided there wasn't a thing worth knowing underneath. And you know what I learned?" She looked at him steady. "I learned that most people never bother to find out what's inside a person before they decide it's empty." She nodded at the table at his sons. "You've got 6 sons who love you so hard, they've been raising themselves rather than trouble you with their grief. You've got a boy of 13 who reads a letter you tried to hide and comes running, because he'd rather trust a stranger than lose one more thing. You've got a 5-year-old who burned his own hand trying to feed his family so nobody'd go without." Her voice shook. "You've got everything, William Hayes. You just stopped being able to see it. And I think maybe I got sent 300 miles not to marry a man who has nothing but to hold up a lamp so a man who has everything could see it again." The kitchen was so quiet you could hear the lamp hiss. James was looking at his father. All 6 of them were looking at their father. And William Hayes, who had buried his wife and buried his heart, and let his whole world lean and rot because he couldn't bear to keep it standing for the ghost of what he'd lost. William Hayes walked slowly to the head of the table, and he put his rough hand on the back of that empty chair, the one Amelia had set for him. He didn't sit yet. He looked down the length of the table at his sons, and then he looked at the woman. The whole town had laughed at that afternoon. The woman he'd tried to send back, standing there in his cold, ruined kitchen, having filled it up with more life in a single afternoon than it had held in 3 years. "I don't reckon I even know how to say grace anymore," he said low and broken. "It's been a while." "Then I'll say it," Amelia said, "and you can just listen." She sat down. The boys reached out first, hesitant, then sure, and took each other's hands, and Samuel reached his little bandaged hand up toward his father. And William Hayes took his youngest son's hand in his, and reached the other across the table. To her. Amelia looked at that big work-scarred hand held out to her across a table full of steaming food and thin children with hope creeping back into their faces for the first time in years. And she took it. "Lord," she said, and her own voice was thick now. "We thank you for this food, and we thank you for this table, and we thank you that even the folks the world throws away can find their way to a warm supper and each other." She squeezed the little hand on one side of her and the big hand on the other. "And we ask you to remember next time somebody looks at a person and decides they're nothing, remind them, Lord, remind them they never once bothered to look inside." She drew a breath. "Amen." "Amen," whispered 6 boys. "Amen," said William Hayes, in a voice like something breaking open. And the 7 of them ate together at a full table in a warm kitchen for the first time since the day the woman of the house had died. And not one of them, not the coldest or the most watchful or the most broken, sat outside it that night. Amelia Carter never did imagine that a single meal would change the fate of 7 lonely men. She had come 300 miles, expecting nothing, braced for cruelty, ready to be sent home. But somewhere between the laughter on that boardwalk and a 5-year-old's bandaged hand held up for her to see, she had understood something that the whole town of Cold Creek had missed and that even William Hayes had forgotten. That a home was never built from money or fine things, or from being beautiful in the way the world counted beauty. A home was built from someone deciding to stay, and Amelia Carter had decided. She just hadn't told anybody yet. The morning after supper, Amelia woke before anyone else in the house. That had always been her way. Back in Missouri, back when her mother was still living and the house still had warmth in it, Amelia had been the first one up, the one who got the stove going and set the day in motion before the rest of the world had opened its eyes. Some women were built for the quiet before dawn. She was one of them. She lay still for a moment on the narrow cot in the small back room William had offered her. Not the good room, not a wife's room, just the spare one off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and she listened to the house. It breathed different at night, she thought. A house that held grief breathed shallow and uneven, like a person sleeping through a bad dream. But even in that first morning dark, she thought she heard something slightly different in it. Something that might, given enough time and enough suppers, become a steadier rhythm. She got up. The stove was cold, and she got it lit without waking anybody. She set the coffee going, real coffee, the last of what she'd brought in her bag from Missouri, and she stood at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn and thought about what needed doing. The list was long. She didn't let it frighten her. She'd been managing impossible lists since she was 8 years old, and her father left and didn't come back, and her mother took sick the first time. She understood that the only way to look at a list like that was one item at a time, one morning at a time, and never look at the whole of it, or you'd sit down on the floor and not get back up. She was stirring oats when she heard bare feet on the floorboards. She turned, expecting Samuel. He'd struck her as an early riser, the way the youngest ones in a neglected house often were up before anybody could ask them to be. But it was James who appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed already, boots on, hat in hand, ready for work. The boy had probably been getting up before sunrise since he was 10. "Coffee's near done," Amelia said. "Sit down, James." He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway like he hadn't been invited past it. "I got chores," he said. "The chores will wait 5 minutes," she said. "Sit down." He sat stiffly on the edge of the nearest chair, like a man in a sheriff's office. She set a cup in front of him. Half coffee, half the last of the sugar she'd saved. He looked at it, and she saw him start to protest. Probably to say he didn't take sugar, or he could do without, or some other version of, "I've been denying myself things so long, I don't remember what I like," and she put her hand up before he could get a word out. "Just drink it," she said. "1 cup of sweet coffee isn't going to hurt your character, James." He wrapped both hands around the cup. He was 16, she'd learned. 16 and running a failing ranch alongside a father who'd partially checked out of the world 3 years ago. She'd met men of 40 who hadn't carried that much weight, and they'd buckled under it. James Hayes had not buckled. But she could see up close in the early kitchen light how close to it he was. The tightness around his eyes. The way he held his shoulders locked up like if he relaxed them for even a second, something would fall. "Your pa up yet?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "What time does he usually rise?" James's mouth pressed flat. "Depends on the night. Some nights he sits up late. Some nights he drinks some. Don't usually see him before sunup anymore." Amelia nodded slow, filed that away. "James," she said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me straight. Can you do that?" He looked at her wary. "Reckon so." "How long have you been making the decisions on this ranch?" The question landed hard. She saw it in his face, the way the jaw worked, the way he looked at the table instead of at her. Like he'd been asked to say something out loud that he'd never said, something he'd carried so quiet and so long, it had grown into him like a thorn grows into bark. "About 2 years, he finally said. "After the second winter. Pa started. He started being somewhere else in his head, even when he was standing right there. So I just..." He shrugged loose and helpless, the most 16-year-old gesture she'd seen him make. "I just started doing it. Somebody had to know when the feed was low. Somebody had to know when the north fence was going, and when the Haller's bull got in with our cows. Somebody had to..." He stopped, cleared his throat. Somebody had to write the letter to the agency. Amelia went very still. "You wrote it," she said. It wasn't a question. James Hayes looked out the window above the stove. His grip on the coffee cup tightened until his knuckles went white. "I copied Pa's hand best I could," he said barely above a whisper. "I found the old letters he'd written Ma before they married. Practiced it for 2 weeks. Then I found the agency's address from another rancher's wife down the road, and I wrote the letter and I signed Pa's name to it." He dragged in a breath. "And I sent it." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "James," Amelia said. "I know it was wrong," he said fast hard before she could say anything more. "I know it was deceitful, and I know I forged a signature, and I know Pa would—" His voice cracked, and he forced it back down. "But Samuel's hand was bleeding, ma'am. And Caleb had been coughing for 2 weeks, and I didn't have money for a doctor, and Danny hadn't talked for a month. Not a single word, just stopped talking. And I looked around at all of them, and I looked at Pa sitting in his chair staring at nothing, and I thought—" He pressed his lips together. "I thought if somebody didn't do something, we were just going to just quietly—" He couldn't finish it. "Fall apart," Amelia said soft. "Fall apart," James repeated, like a verdict. She got up from her chair, and she came around the table, and she did something she hadn't planned to do this early this soon. She put her hand on that 16-year-old boy's shoulder. This child who had been pretending to be a man for 2 years, who had forged a letter out of pure, desperate love for his brothers, who had read a stranger off a stagecoach in 30 seconds, and decided to bet the whole ranch on her, and she kept it there. He didn't shake her off. He stiffened, braced, and then like a wall that's held too long, she felt something in him give just slightly. "You did the right thing," she said. "I lied," he said. "You saved your family," she said. "And those 2 things can both be true at the same time. You hear me. They can both be true, and the world won't end." She squeezed his shoulder once and let go, because she knew the worst thing she could do right now was push too deep, too fast. She'd learned that from her mother. You didn't drain a wound all at once. You let it come slow. "Now you're going to have to tell your father eventually. You understand that?" James went rigid again. "I know," he said. "But not today," she said. "Today, we just get the chores done and see if we can get your brother talking again. One thing at a time." She went back around the table and picked up her wooden spoon. "Drink your coffee, James, while it's hot." He drank it. He didn't say thank you, but when he left for the morning chores 20 minutes later, he stood straight. He hadn't stood that straight since she'd known him, which wasn't long, but she could tell the difference. By the time the other boys began appearing in the kitchen, the oats were done, and the kitchen was warm, and Amelia had found 3 cracked eggs in the cool pantry and scrambled them out to stretch between 7 people. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and she put it on the table with the last heel of last night's bread toasted on the stove, and she watched the boys sit down like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they'd been doing it their whole lives instead of just one night. Danny, the quiet one, had sat beside her tonight, where last night he'd been at the far end. She noticed but didn't remark on it. William came in late. She heard him before she saw him, the slow, deliberate footsteps of a man moving through a headache, the kind that sat behind the eyes and didn't leave till noon. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's clothes, his hair standing, and he took one look at the full table, and something moved across his face, too fast for her to name. "Morning." Amelia said the same tone she'd use for any man. "Miss Carter," he said roughly. "There's coffee, and oats if you're hungry. Sit down." He didn't argue. He sat, and she poured his coffee, and she watched the boys' eyes track between their father and this woman they'd known for one day, testing the temperature of it the way children always did. "Thank you," William said into the mug, not quite looking at her. "You're welcome," she said. And that was all. For now, that was enough. The morning showed her what 3 years of grief and inattention could do to a working ranch, and it was worse than a single evening's look had told her. The garden was salvageable if they moved fast. There was good soil there. She could see it, and the season wasn't done. The barn roof was dangerous and needed addressing before the weather turned. The boys' clothes were in a state that was beyond simple mending for half of them. The smokehouse had nothing in it. The pantry was closer to empty than anyone had said out loud, and the look on James's face when he thought nobody was watching the shelves told her he'd known it for weeks and hadn't figured out how to tell his father without it coming out as an accusation. She didn't say any of this to William. She started with the garden. She went out after breakfast with a hoe she found against the barn wall, and she began pulling weeds. It was the kind of work she knew in her bones, the kind that asked nothing of her mind, so her mind could go elsewhere. She'd pulled weeds behind her mother's house in Missouri every summer of her life, and she could do it in her sleep. She'd been at it maybe 20 minutes when she heard the back door, and then the soft sound of small feet on the ground behind her. She turned. Samuel was there. Bandaged hand held close, holding out a battered tin cup of water with his other hand. "Pa said you'd be thirsty," he said, very serious. Amelia straightened up and took the cup. "Your pa's right," she said. "Thank you, Samuel." The little boy stood there after she took the cup, making no move to go back inside, just watching her. "You want to help?" she asked. He nodded fast. She showed him how to tell a weed from a seedling, the ones that needed to stay from the ones that needed to go, and he listened with such concentrated attention that she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep the smile from going too wide and frightening him off. A child that age wanted to feel capable, not indulged. "You're good at this," she told him after 20 minutes of him pulling the right things and leaving the right things alone. "I was always good at the plants," he confided. "James wouldn't let me do the stove no more after I burned it, but he let me do the garden." He paused, picking at a weed with careful fingers. "James let me do the quiet things. He said I was better at quiet things." Amelia thought about a 16-year-old sorting his baby brother's capabilities and giving him tasks that wouldn't get him hurt, and had to take a moment. "He was right," she said. "Quiet things are important things." "Miss Amelia," Samuel said very small. "Are you going to leave?" He didn't look up when he said it. He kept his eyes on the ground, like the answer might hurt less that way. "The lady before you left, the one Pa sent for before you. She came, and then she left after 2 days, and Pa didn't talk for a week." Amelia's hoe stopped. There had been someone before her. Nobody had told her that. She turned to look at the house, and then back at the boy, and she crouched down so her eyes were level with his. "What was her name?" she asked. Samuel shrugged his thin shoulders. "She didn't tell us her name. She just left. She said the house was too broken." He finally looked up, and his face was the most serious 5-year-old face she had ever seen in her life. "Are we too broken, Miss Amelia?" It hit her so hard she had to breathe through it. "No," she said very firm. "Nobody's too broken. You hear me? Broken means it happened. Not broken means it can't be fixed. And I have never in my life seen something that couldn't be fixed if somebody was willing to put in the time." She cupped his chin in her hand, dirt and all. "And I am willing, Samuel. I am very, very willing." The boy studied her. "You got a strong face," he decided. "I got a stubborn face," Amelia corrected. Samuel smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it was the kind of smile that rewrote a room. She understood in that second why his father had gone hollow when his wife died, because a place that held that kind of smile had something devastating to lose. She went back to weeding, and Samuel went back to his careful pulling, and neither of them spoke for a while. But they weren't quiet alone. They were quiet together. That was different. It was mid-morning when the rider came. Amelia heard the horse before she saw the man, and she looked up to see a rider coming down the approach at a clip that meant business. She didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize anybody in this county yet, but she recognized the type. Well-fed horse, good saddle, the kind of man whose coat stayed clean because other people did the dirty work. She straightened up and waited. He reined in at the garden fence and looked down at her with the look she'd been getting her whole life. The sizing up look, the one that did its math quick and came up with its sum before she'd said a word, but there was something else in this one. something cool and deliberate that had nothing to do with her size. "Is Hayes about?" he said. "No, ma'am, no hat tipping. He's working," Amelia said. "Can I help you?" The man smiled with his mouth only. "I doubt that. Name's Garrett. Franklin Garrett. I have business with William Hayes, and it won't wait." He looked her over. "You the housekeeper he hired?" "I'm his wife," Amelia said. The smile didn't change. "That's right. I heard he'd sent off for a woman." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, if you'd be so kind as to pass this along. Payment's been called due. 30 days or the north parcel reverts to the Garrett Land Company." He held it out over the fence. Amelia took it. She looked at the envelope, thick, official looking. The kind of envelope that changed hands right before something bad happened. "I'll see he gets it," she said. "You do that," Garrett said, and pulled his horse around and rode back out the way he'd come without another word. She stood there holding the envelope and watching him go, and a cold feeling walked up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the morning air. She'd seen men like Franklin Garrett before. Not this man specifically, but the type. The ones who showed up on good horses with clean coats and legal-sounding papers right when a family was at their lowest, and what they called due payment was generally closer to a trap that had been set and was now being sprung. She went to find William. She found him in the barn working on a stretch of harness that had cracked. He looked up when she came in, and she held out the envelope without preamble. "A man named Garrett just left that," she said. "Rode in like he owned the road." Something happened to William Hayes's face when she said that name. The color didn't drain out of it exactly. It was more like the light went out. Like something behind his eyes had been expecting. This had been waiting for it for months, and now that it had arrived, the only thing left was a particular kind of tired that had no bottom to it. "How long has he been circling?" Amelia asked. William set the harness down. He pressed both palms flat on the workbench and stood there like a man steadying himself against a current. "About a year," he said. "North parcel's been in dispute. Martha's my wife's family left it to her. When she died, Garrett started claiming some old filings said it reverted to his family's land patent on default." He didn't look at her. "I ain't got a lawyer, Miss Carter. Can't afford one. And I ain't got the money for whatever he's calling due." "What's he calling due?" "Back taxes on the parcel. Says they've been accumulating while I wasn't paying attention, which is true. I'll own that I wasn't paying attention to a lot of things." The self-condemnation in that was so heavy, Amelia could nearly see it. "If I can't come up with the money in 30 days, he takes the parcel. And the north parcel's where most of our grazing is. Without it—" He stopped. "Without it, the ranch can't run," Amelia said. "Not cattle, no." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been going down slowly for so long, he's made his peace with the bottom. "I've been losing this fight for a year, Miss Carter. You came in at the tail end of a story that wasn't ever going to end well." And here was where Amelia Carter did something that would be talked about in the county for years after, though nobody who talked about it ever quite understood what had driven it. She took the envelope from him, opened it, read every word of it from top to bottom, folded it up, and looked at William Hayes. "It's county tax records he's citing," she said. William blinked. "You read legal. My mother was educated," Amelia said, "and she taught me. And I spent 3 years handling her affairs when she couldn't do it herself. I've read enough legal paper to know what's real and what's a bluff." She tapped the envelope. "These numbers don't match. The tax rate he's quoting went down in 1878. He's using the old rate. The amount he's claiming you owe is inflated by almost 30%. The barn went very quiet. William stared at her. "Are you sure?" he said. "No," she said honestly. "I'd need to see the county records to be sure. But I'm sure enough to say this isn't straightforward. I'm sure enough to say don't sign anything and don't pay anything until somebody who knows the law looks at it." She held the envelope out. "Who's the nearest honest man in this county who knows the law?" "Judge Hollis in Millerton. William said slowly, like a man waking up. He's 20 miles, but he's honest. Then that's where we need to go, Amelia said. William looked at her for a long moment with something she could not name in his expression. You rode 300 miles on a bad promise, he said. You dressed my boy's hand and fed my family, and now you're... He stopped. Why, he said. It came out raw and unguarded, the way questions only come out when a person has finally stopped being careful. Why are you doing any of this? Amelia looked at him. She could have given him a dozen answers. She could have been practical, or kind, or gentle. She could have talked about duty, or about doing what was right. All of those things would have been true. But what she said was, because Samuel asked me this morning if he was too broken to fix, and I told him no. And I do not say things I don't mean, William Hayes, so I reckon I've got to prove it. He didn't say anything. She walked back toward the house. She was halfway across the yard when his voice came behind her. Miss Carter. She turned. William Hayes was standing in the barn doorway with the envelope in his hand, and the morning light was on him, and he looked like a man who had been asleep for 3 years, and was only now painfully starting to come awake. When could you be ready to ride to Millerton? He said. Tomorrow morning, she said. If you can have the wagon ready. He nodded once. She turned back to the house. She hadn't been back at the garden 10 minutes when she heard shouting. Not the working outside kind. The sharp, sudden kind that sent a spike of cold up her spine before she'd even registered what she'd heard. She dropped the hoe and went around the side of the house fast, and she found Ethan and Caleb squared off in the yard with the force of boys who've been keeping something tamped down too long. Ethan had both fists up. Caleb had a cut over one eyebrow that was leaking blood down the side of his face, and his eyes were bright with the particular fury of someone who's been told the truth they didn't want to hear. You don't know what you're talking about, Caleb said. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Ethan said. You want to blame her like you blamed everybody else. That ain't fair and you know it. She's been here one day, Caleb said. One day, Ethan. And now suddenly Pa's riding to Millerton with her, and she's in the garden, and she's in our kitchen, and... She fed us. Ethan's voice cracked. She fed us, and she fixed Samuel's hand, and she didn't leave. She's the only one who stayed, and you're going to... She's not Ma! Caleb screamed it, and then the yard went completely still. Even the boys behind the fence went still. Even James, coming out of the barn with a rope in his hand, stopped dead. Caleb's chest was heaving. The blood was running down the side of his face, and he wasn't touching it. He was just standing there shaking with 3 years of grief that had no shape to it anymore. Grief that had been compressed and packed down until it had nowhere to go but sideways into his brother. She ain't trying to be, Amelia said. Caleb swung around. She was standing 6 feet away. She hadn't rushed in. She'd waited for the explosion to come to its peak, because that was how it worked. You couldn't interrupt a storm, you could only stand steady through it. She ain't trying to be your mother, Amelia said quiet the way you talk to a frightened animal that still has its teeth. And I'll tell you that plain, and I'll tell it to your face because you deserve somebody to be honest with you. She walked toward him slow. I cannot be her. I don't want to be her. Your mother was something I could never be, and I wouldn't try. She stopped in front of him. But I'm here. I'm actually standing here. And I intend to keep standing here. And all I am asking Caleb, is that you let me. Caleb's face was shaking apart. He was 15 years old, and he'd buried his mother, and he'd been so angry for so long he didn't know what was underneath the anger anymore. What if you leave? He said, and his voice had come completely apart now. What if you leave like she did? The other one. She came and then she left, Amelia said. I know. Samuel told me. Then what makes you different? Caleb said, broken and furious and heartbroken all at once. Amelia looked at him straight. Because I've already lost everything I had, she said, and I'm still standing in your garden at 8 in the morning pulling weeds. That's the only evidence I can give you right now. But that's real, Caleb. That's something I'm actually doing. And every day I'm still here. That's another piece of evidence. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to let me earn it. She tilted her head at his eyebrow. "Now let me see your face." He stood rigid for 3 full seconds. Then he dropped his fists. She cleaned the cut over his eyebrow with water and a cloth at the kitchen table, and he sat there, letting her do it with the careful, furious dignity of a boy who refused to cry in front of anyone but had run entirely out of ways to hold it back. The tear that got away from him he didn't even know about until she touched his cheek with the back of her hand gentle, and he flinched like she'd burned him. "You don't have to be fine all the time," she said. He didn't answer. But he didn't move away either. James, who'd come in behind them and was standing at the far side of the kitchen with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched, watching all of this, let out a long, careful breath through his nose that told her he'd been holding it in. Ethan hovered in the doorway. "You're both going to apologize to each other," Amelia said, without looking up from Caleb's eyebrow. "Not right now, but before supper." "He started it," Ethan muttered. "I know," Amelia said. "And you'll still both apologize. That's how people who live together work. The who started it stops mattering eventually. What matters is that you're brothers. And you're going to be brothers a lot longer than you're going to be angry at each other." She pressed a clean cloth against the cut. "Hold that." Caleb held it. "Miss Amelia," Ethan said from the doorway. Are you and Pa going to Millerton about the Garrett man?" She looked up sharp. "You know about Garrett." Ethan and Caleb exchanged a look, and it was James who answered, coming away from the wall where he'd been holding up the plaster. "We all know about Garrett," James said flatly. "He came out here twice while Pa was in the fields last month. I talked to him myself." His voice had gone cold in the way of someone who has assessed a threat and filed it correctly. "He told me the ranch would be bank-held by spring. He told me to tell Pa to take what he could get and cut his losses." James's eyes were flat and hard. "And then he looked at me like he was doing me a kindness by saying it." The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you say?" Amelia asked. "I told him to get off our land," James said. "He said I was a boy. I said a boy could read a legal document as good as a man." He laughed. James's jaw tightened. "He's done this before, ma'am. To the Walkers over on the east side 2 years ago. They were grieving too. Mrs. Walker had just died, and Garrett got the paper on them, and they were gone inside 6 months. Ranch is sitting empty now." He looked at Amelia. "He picks people when they're down. That's his business. That's all his business is." The kitchen felt different now. The grief in the Hayes house was real, and she'd known it from the moment she walked in. But underneath the grief was something else. She was only now starting to see clearly. Something that had been waiting to find a shape. These boys were not only broken, they were angry. And anger properly aimed was the most useful thing in the world. "Then here's what's going to happen," Amelia said. She set down the cloth. She put both hands flat on the table the way her mother used to do when she meant business. "Your Pa and I are going to Millerton tomorrow to see Judge Hollis. We're going to look at the county tax records and find out what Garrett is actually owed versus what he's claiming. James, I need you to write down everything you remember about what Garrett said to you. The exact words if you can. Ethan, Caleb, same. Everything you remember." The 3 older boys straightened. "Danny," Amelia said, turning to the quiet one who had materialized in the corner as silently as smoke. "Do you know anything about this?" Danny was still a moment. Then, in his soft, careful voice, he said, "He talked to the Hallers too, the family down the road, last spring. Mr. Haller said Garrett tried to buy him out for half of what the land was worth. Mr. Haller said no, and then his fences kept going down. 3 times. Always the same section." The kitchen was very, very quiet. "He pressures people," Amelia said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Danny said. She looked around at the 5 of them. James, with his jaw set. Ethan and Caleb, the split and swelling forgotten, leaning forward like hunting dogs that had finally found a trail. Danny, with his still face that missed nothing. And Samuel at the edge of the table, too young to understand the legal pieces, but old enough to understand that something important was happening in his kitchen. "All right," Amelia said. "All right what?" James asked. "All right," she said again, slower the way you said a thing when you were making up your mind out loud. "I came out here to be a wife and a mother. I didn't come here to fight a land war." She paused. "But I've been fighting since I was 8 years old, boys, and I am very, very good at it." William Hayes appeared in the kitchen doorway at that exact moment. He'd been in from the barn long enough to hear the last of it, probably, or enough of it. He stood there looking at Amelia at his table with his 5 older boys arranged around her like she'd always been the center of that room. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Amelia. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked up. "I sent a message this morning to Tom Haller," he said. "Told him what you'd found in the Garrett envelope, about the tax rate." He held her gaze. "He said his wife's cousin is a surveyor out of Helena, who knows the county record books better than any lawyer in the territory. He said she'd come if we asked." He stopped. "I want to ask." Amelia let out a slow breath. "Then ask," she said. He nodded, and when he left the kitchen, James looked at Amelia with something new on his face. Not the wariness of the morning. Not the rigid, braced weight of a boy carrying too much for too long. Something quieter than hope. Something more solid. The beginning of belief. She set them all back to work before the morning got away from them. The garden, the chores, the horses, the barn roof that couldn't wait much longer. She moved through the ranch like she'd always known where everything was, and the truth was, she could read a working place, the way she could read a face. The bones of it were always the same, even when the surface had changed. But all the while at the back of her mind, she was thinking about Franklin Garrett on his clean horse, with his legal envelope and his smile that didn't reach his eyes. She was thinking about the Walkers gone inside 6 months. She was thinking about the Hallers' fences. She was thinking about 3 years of a grieving family, too deep in loss to see what was being built around them while they were down. And she was thinking about a woman who had sold everything she had in Missouri and come 300 miles because a letter said there was a family that needed her. She hadn't known what she was walking into, but she was starting to understand that maybe she was exactly what the Hayes Ranch needed. Not just someone to cook and mend and hold a household together. Someone who had nothing left to lose and was too stubborn to quit. And that was the most dangerous kind of woman in the world. The evening came in gold and soft the way Montana evenings did, even when everything under them was hard. She made supper from the last of the reasonable stores, and it was thin, but it was good, and all 6 boys sat down at that table again without being asked. Like one night had been enough to rewrite what was normal. Like bodies remember warmth faster than minds remember to be careful. William sat down too. He said grace this time. Brief. Rough. Like a man who'd forgotten the words and was making do with the ones he still had. But he said it. And when Samuel reached across and put his little bandaged hand on his father's arm, just to feel that he was there, William covered it with his own hand and left it, and nobody in the room remarked on it, and nobody needed to. It was the second supper. It was already different from the first. That was how it worked. That was how anything broken started to stop being broken. Not in one moment. Not in a single meal, or a single conversation, or a single decision to stay. In 2 suppers. Then 3. And then one morning, you woke up and the house was breathing even. The wagon ride to Millerton took nearly 3 hours, and William Hayes did not say 20 words the whole way there. Amelia didn't push him. She'd learned in 2 days what it had taken some women years to understand about a man like William, that silence wasn't absence. It was where he went to hold himself together. A man who'd been cracking apart for 3 years didn't talk his way back to solid ground. He worked his way there. He drove his way there. He sat with his shoulders squared against the morning wind and his hands steady on the reins, and he got himself from 1 mile to the next, and that was how he survived. She could respect that. She'd done the same thing herself on different roads. The county clerk's office in Millerton was a narrow room that smelled like old paper and boot leather, and the clerk behind the counter was a thin man of 60 with reading spectacles and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent his career in poor light. He looked up when they came in, and he looked at Amelia, first the up and down look, the practiced pause, and then he looked at William. "Hayes," he said, not unfriendly, not warm. "Been a while." "Collins," William said. "I need to look at the county tax assessment records, North Parcel Hazeland, going back 4 years. Collins didn't move right away. "You got a dispute filed?" "Not yet," William said. "Might be one coming." The old clerk looked at Amelia again, longer this time. "This your wife," he said. "She is," William said, and he said it without a single beat of hesitation, and Amelia felt something small and warm move in her chest that she put right down again before it could get established. Collins got the ledgers. Amelia sat at the clerk's table with 4 years of county tax records spread in front of her, and she went through them the way her mother had taught her, slow, patient, line by line, not skipping anything, because the thing you skip is always the thing that matters. William sat beside her. He watched her read with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who was letting himself rely on someone and was frightened by how much he needed it to work. She found it in 40 minutes. "There," she said. She pointed. William leaned in. "The rate changed in 1878, she said, keeping her voice level. County lowered it by 18% after the drought assessment. Garrett's invoice is using the 1875 rate, the one before the change." She ran her finger down the column. "If you calculate what's actually owed at the correct rate going back 4 years, the amount is $61, not $212. William went very still. "He's claiming I owe $212, he said. "I know," Amelia said. "He's claiming $151 that doesn't exist under current county law." Collins had been standing at the end of the table pretending to organize something. He stopped pretending. "If somebody were to file a formal dispute," he said carefully, like a man choosing his words around something sharp, "I'd be required to pull the official assessment rate documentation and attach it to the record." He set down what he was holding. "I've been the clerk here 11 years, Hayes. I've seen this kind of discrepancy before." He looked at his own hands. "I'll say that much." William looked at Collins, then at Amelia, then back at the ledger. "He's done this to other people," William said. It wasn't a question. He was putting it together out loud, and the pieces were going together fast now, and his face was going through something that Amelia watched carefully, because it was the face of a man who had believed for a year that he was losing, because he deserved to lose discovering that the game had been crooked from the start. That kind of discovery could go 2 ways. It could break a man open into helplessness, all that acceptance, all that surrender, suddenly exposed as unnecessary, or it could light something. William Hayes went very quiet, and the quiet he went into was not the same quiet as the wagon ride up. "Collins," he said, "what do I need to file the dispute?" "Written statement of the discrepancy citing the rate document," Collins said. "2 witnesses to the filing, and Judge Hollis's signature if you want it held proper." "Judge Hollis is in town today?" Amelia asked. Collins nodded. "Tuesday's his Millerton day. Office is 2 doors down." William was already standing. Judge Hollis was 70 years old and built like a man who had been large once and had lost the flesh but kept the frame. He had a face like hammered leather and eyes that were sharper than anything in them had a right to be. He looked at Amelia's notation from the tax ledger, looked at the Garrett invoice, looked at the county rate change documentation Collins had sent over by errand boy, and he set all 3 documents down on his desk in a row. Then he looked at William Hayes. "How long has Garrett been at you?" he said. "About a year," William said. Hollis nodded slow, like that confirmed something he already suspected. "He approached the Hallers last spring." "Yes, sir," William said. "The Buckleys before them," Hollis said. William blinked. "I don't know about the Buckleys. Eastern County 3 years back," Hollis said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Franklin Garrett has been acquiring land in this county for 6 years. He works the same way every time. He finds families under pressure, grief, debt, illness, and he moves on them with paperwork that looks legitimate and numbers that are close enough to real to be convincing to a man who's too tired and too overwhelmed to check every line. His eyes moved to Amelia. He usually succeeds because nobody checks every line. Amelia met his eyes. I was raised to check every line, she said. Clearly, said Hollis with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Who are you exactly? Amelia Carter Hayes, she said, and it was the second time she'd said that name, and it still sat strangely in her mouth like a shoe she hadn't broken in yet. I came out from Missouri. I've been on the ranch 5 days. 5 days, Hollis repeated. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. I'm signing the dispute, he said. And I'm going to recommend the county assessor open a full review of Garrett's land acquisitions going back 5 years. That will take time, but it stops the clock on your parcel, Hayes. He cannot move on the north land while a formal review is pending. He looked up at William. Keep your records clean. Don't sign anything from him. Don't speak to him without a witness. And if he comes on your land again, you send word to my office directly. William nodded. His throat moved. Judge, he said rough. I thank you. Thank your wife? Hollis said. I'm just the signature. They were out the door and halfway down the boardwalk when William stopped. Amelia stopped too. He was looking straight ahead, not at her at some fixed point in the middle distance, and his jaw was working the way it did when he was trying to get words up from somewhere they didn't want to leave. I had given up, he said. Just that. Flat. Stated like a fact, not an excuse. I know, Amelia said. I thought the ranch was just... He stopped. I thought everything was just going the way things go when a man doesn't deserve to hold on to them. Amelia looked at the side of his face. And you thought you didn't deserve to hold on to them? He didn't answer, but the line of his shoulders answered for him. William, she said. Not Mr. Hayes. William. Whatever you've been telling yourself for 3 years about what you deserve, I need you to hear me say that it's not true. A man who raised 6 boys alone through 3 hard winters and kept them fed and clothed and under a roof while his heart was busted clean through, that is not a man who deserves to lose everything. She paused. That is a man who was too deep in grief to see someone was taking advantage of it. He turned and looked at her, then fully the way he hadn't quite managed since that first day in the street. And what she saw in his face was something that frightened her a little, because it was the look of a man who had been handed back something he'd been sure was gone and wasn't yet certain what to do with it. Why are you fighting for my ranch? He said. Because your sons live on it, she said simply. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away, and she saw his throat move again. We should get back, he said rough. We should, she agreed. And they walked back to the wagon, and he helped her up without being asked. Which was the first time he'd done that, and neither of them said anything about it, and the drive home was quieter than the drive out. But it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that had something in it. They came back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and Amelia knew something was wrong before the wagon had fully stopped. She felt at first that particular charged stillness of a place that has just had something happen in it. The way sound had gone wrong, the way the yard felt held. Then she heard it. Crying. Not a child's crying. Something older and uglier and trying very hard to be silent. She was down from the wagon before William had set the brake. She followed the sound around the side of the barn, and she found Danny. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the barn wall, and his knees pulled to his chest, and he was doing that terrible thing of crying without making noise, the way children learn to do when they'd decided that their grief was a problem for other people, when they'd been taught without anyone meaning to teach them that their sadness was an inconvenience. His whole body was shaking with it, and his face was buried in his arms, and he didn't hear her coming. She sat down on the ground beside him, in the dirt in her traveling dress without a word. He startled. His head came up. His face was a wreck-red streaked eyes swollen, and the expression he wore when he saw her was one she recognized from her own mirror at 17, the shame of being caught feeling something too big. I'm sorry, he gasped. I'm sorry, I'll... Hush, Amelia said. Don't apologize for that. I was just... He pressed the back of his hand to his face. I was just being stupid. Daniel, she said, firm but quiet, because she'd learned that this particular boy needed his full name when she was serious. You are 10 years old. You are allowed to cry. You are allowed to cry loudly if you want. Nobody's going to penalize you for having feelings in front of me. He dragged in a ragged breath. What happened? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in pieces. There was a man. He came while you and Pa were gone. He wasn't Garrett, I don't think. He was younger. He rode in and he talked to James, and James told him to go, but he said... Danny swallowed hard. He said our Pa was a fool, and our Ma was dead, and there wasn't a woman alive who'd stay in this place past a month. He said... His voice broke entirely. He said the woman Pa married looked like she'd eat more than the cattle. The air around Amelia went very still. She said nothing for a moment. And then, she said, James hit him, Danny said. Something moved in Amelia's chest, pride and sorrow and fury all at once. Is James all right? His hand, Danny said. He the man's saddle horn when the horse moved. He pressed his own hand against his sternum, showing her. His knuckles split. Caleb rapped it. He's okay. But he's mad, Miss Amelia. He's so mad. And I don't know if it's at the man or at himself for not... He stopped again. For not protecting me better, Amelia said. Danny looked up at her. Yes, ma'am, he said, barely a sound. She sat with that. A 16-year-old boy had split his knuckles on someone's saddle horn for her. A boy she'd known 5 days. A boy who had started this whole thing by forging a letter out of love so sheer and desperate it had reached 300 miles and pulled her here. Where's James now? She asked. In the barn, Danny said. He won't come out. He thinks you're going to be upset that he hit somebody on account of... Amelia was already standing. She found James exactly where Danny had said, in the back of the barn, sitting on a hay bale with his right hand wrapped in Caleb's hasty bandaging, and his jaw set so tight she could see the muscle working. He looked up when she came in and immediately looked back down. Before you say anything, he started. Good, Amelia said. He stopped. Good, he repeated. I said good, she said. I'm not going to tell you fighting is the right answer every time, James, because it isn't. But I will tell you that a man who says things like that about a woman, any woman, and rides up onto another man's land to say, it has decided that nobody here is going to push back. She sat down on the bale beside him, uninvited, the way she'd been doing everything since she got here. And I don't want anyone in this family to be the kind of people who don't push back. James turned and looked at her, and she could see him trying to work out if this was real or if she was managing him. You're not upset, he said. I am upset, she said. I'm upset that a man rode up here and said those things. I'm upset that Danny had to hear it. I'm upset that you hurt your hand. She looked at the bandaging. But I am not upset at you. She paused. Let me see it. He held it out, reluctant. She unwrapped Caleb's work. Not bad, actually. Caleb had a steady hand and looked at the split knuckles. Swollen, but clean. Nothing broken. This is going to hurt tomorrow more than today, she said. I know, he said. She rewrapped it properly, and he watched her do it, and there was something in the watching that she'd been tracking in him for 5 days. This careful provisional attention, the attention of a person deciding by degrees whether they were safe. James, she said without looking up from the bandaging. I need to tell you something about me, and I need you to hear it right. All right, he said, careful. I have been underestimated my whole life. Men have said worse things than that to my face, not about me to someone else to my face since I was young enough that I didn't know yet I was supposed to care. She tied off the bandaging. I stopped letting those words land about 15 years ago. They go past me now. They don't reach anything. She looked up at him. So when a man comes to your yard and says something like that, you don't have to fight for my honor because my honor isn't in danger. But you may absolutely fight for this family's right to be left in peace on its own land. She held his gaze. There's a difference. Do you understand that difference? James was quiet for the long moment. Yes, ma'am, he said. Then, which one was it today? Protecting this family's land, she said. He nodded slowly. Then I'd do it again, he said, flat, certain. I know you would, she said. And then, because he needed it and had earned it, your mother would be proud of you. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it to make you feel better. I say it because I've watched you for 5 days, and it's the truest thing I know about you. James Hayes did not cry. He was too old for it, or thought he was, or had been too long without the room to do it. But something in his face did something moved deep and old and careful, like tectonic plates making a very small adjustment that would eventually change everything on the surface. Thank you, he said rough. Ma'am. Amelia, she said. He looked at her. You can call me Amelia, she said. If you want to. He tried it quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. Amelia. She stood up and smoothed her skirt. Come in for supper when you're ready, she said, and tell your brothers to wash up. She was nearly at the barn door when his voice came behind her. The man who came today, James said. He works for Garrett. She stopped. How do you know? She said. I recognized his horse, James said. It's the same horse that was tied outside the Garrett land office last month when I went into town for feed. Same horse, same brand. He paused. Garrett sent him here on purpose. To rattle us. Maybe to rattle you. Maybe to see if you'd leave. Amelia stood in the barn doorway for a moment looking at the evening sky. Garrett already knew she'd been to Millerton. That was the only explanation. He had ears in the county clerk's office or near it. He knew they'd looked at the records. He'd sent someone to the ranch while they were gone to take the temperature of things, to see what he was dealing with. He'd found out. James, she said, tomorrow morning I need you to write down everything you remember about that horse. Brand color markings the saddle if you noticed it, and the man describe him as best you can. For Judge Hollis, James asked. For Judge Hollis, she confirmed. She walked back to the house, and she did not let any of it show on her face, because the younger boys were in the yard, and Samuel was running toward her already, with something in his good hand, a wildflower bent and half crushed from being clutched too tight in a small fist. I found it in the garden, he said, holding it up. I kept it for you. Amelia took the bedraggled flower and looked at it. It's the prettiest flower I've ever been given, she said, meaning it. And Samuel beamed. Inside, she put the flower in a tin cup on the kitchen windowsill and set about supper, and she did not think about Franklin Garrett again until the boys were in bed and the house had gone quiet. Then she thought about him. William found her at the kitchen table after the last lamp was down in the hall, sitting with the Garrett invoice and Collins's ledger copy, and her own notes spread in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. He'd clearly been heading to bed and hadn't expected her to still be up. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. He came in and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers. He rubbed the back of his neck. James told me about the man today, he said. I figured he would. I should have been here. You were doing something more important, she said. He shook his head. A man comes onto my land and says things like that about my wife. I should have been here. The word landed in the room between them. Wife. He'd said it himself this time, not Collins, not Hollis. And he'd said it the same way, without hesitation, without qualification. Amelia set her pencil down. William, she said carefully. Can I ask you something? He looked at her. Reckon you're going to regardless. What do you know about why Garrett started on the north parcel? She said. Not the legal history, the real reason, the why of it. William was quiet for a moment. Martha's father filed the original claim on that parcel in 1864, he said. It was good grazing land even then. When the railroad surveys started coming through in the mid-70s, the word was the rail line might come up through the North Valley. He paused. If the rail line goes through that parcel, it's worth 10 times what it is as grazing land, maybe more. Amelia was very still. Does Garrett know about the rail survey? She said. He knows everything about this county, William said. He makes it his business. Then this was never about back taxes, Amelia said. No, William said. No, I reckon it wasn't. They sat with that. He's been waiting for you to be desperate enough to sign, Amelia said, and every time you weren't desperate enough, he manufactured a little more pressure. She looked at the papers. The inflated tax bill. The man he sends to your ranch to unsettle your family. He's been managing the temperature on you the way you manage a fire, keeping it just high enough. William looked at his hands. I had no idea the rail survey was still live, he said. I thought they'd abandoned the northern route years back. I don't think they have, Amelia said. She watched him take that in. The full shape of it. The year of pressure of believing he was just a failing man, failing to keep a failing ranch, when what had actually been happening was a deliberate and calculated campaign to push him to the edge. He sent that man to the ranch today to see if I'd leave, Amelia said. William looked up. Because a wife who leaves solves his problem, she said. Puts you back to isolated and overwhelmed. Makes you easier to move on. She held his gaze. He doesn't know me. Something moved in William's jaw. No, he said. He doesn't. She started gathering her papers. I need to write to the railroad land office in Helena, she said, to get the current status of the Northern Survey. If the line is still being considered, it changes the legal weight of your land claim significantly. It gives you leverage. She stopped. Do you know anyone in Helena? Anyone who could get that information faster than a letter? William thought. Martha's cousin Sarah, she married a man who works for the Territorial Administration. I haven't spoken to her and not since Martha's funeral. I don't know if... Could you write to her? Amelia said. He paused. She might not answer. I wasn't after Martha died. I wasn't kind to the people who tried to stay in touch. I pushed most of them away. Write anyway, Amelia said. Tell her the truth. Tell her what's happening. People generally want to help when you let them see you need it. She paused. That's been your hardest lesson, hasn't it? Letting people see you need something. He didn't answer, but he didn't argue. She was putting the last of the papers away when he said her name. Not Miss Carter. Not ma'am. Her name. Amelia. She looked up. When you came here, he said slowly, like he was constructing each word with care. I thought I was looking at a mistake. Something to be managed and sent back. He stopped, started again. I have been wrong about a number of things in the past 3 years, but I think that first assessment was the wrongest thing I've thought in a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. I know, Amelia said. That ain't me trying to be smooth, he said. I don't have smooth left in me. I'm just trying to say that I see it now. What's here? He looked at his hands. What you're doing for my children, and for this ranch, and I... He stopped. I don't know how to thank a person for something that big. You don't have to thank me, she said. You just have to let me stay. He raised his eyes to hers. I want you to stay, he said. The words were plain and unadorned the way everything was with him. No flourish, no embellishment. Just the raw fact of it, put down on the table between them, like something he'd finally stopped being afraid to set down. Amelia looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. At the grief-worn, honest, stubborn, slowly waking face of a man who had been drowning for 3 years and was only now reaching for something to hold. Then we agree, she said. She took her papers and went to her room. She lay on the narrow cot in the dark, and she listened to the house breathe, and it was breathing different again. Still not steady, not yet, but fuller, like a chest that's been collapsed long enough starts to expand again when somebody finally shows it how. 3 days later, the storm came. It came fast, the way Montana storms did. The sky going from gray to green in under an hour, the wind swinging hard from the north and dropping the temperature 20 degrees between noon and 2 in the afternoon. Amelia had been in the garden when she first smelled it, and she'd known it immediately. She'd grown up on Missouri weather, and she understood what a sky that color meant. She went inside and she started moving. "James," she said, finding him in the barn. "How many of the cattle are on the north pasture?" James straightened fast. "About 30 head. Why?" He looked at the sky and his face changed. "Oh, God." "Get Ethan and Caleb. Get them in from the north pasture before it hits. Can you do that in time? If we ride now?" he said, already moving. "Ride now," she said. "Go." She went back to the house and she found Danny in the kitchen and Samuel trailing behind him, and she looked at Danny's steady face and she made a decision. "Danny," she said, "you're going to help me get everything loose secured in the yard. Everything that can fly, we need it down or tied. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, already reading her urgency. "Samuel," she said, crouching to the little boy, "you're going inside, and you're going to stay in the kitchen, and you're not going to open the back door for anything except me or James. Do you understand?" Samuel's eyes were large. He nodded. "If the lamp goes out," she said, "you leave it out. You don't try to light it. You just sit at the table and wait for me. All right?" "All right," he whispered. She looked for William. He wasn't in the barn. He wasn't in the yard. She went around the back of the property in the rising wind and found him coming back from the far fence line, and she saw immediately that something had happened. He was moving wrong. One shoulder dropped and his right arm not swinging right. "William," she called. He looked up and she went toward him and got close enough to see his face, which was gray and tight with pain. "The fence post," he said, brief. "Top wire snapped while I was pulling it. Hit my shoulder." He moved it experimentally and made a sound that told her everything. "It ain't broken. I've had broken, but you can't help me get those cattle in," she said. "James?" "James is already going," she said. "Come with me. Right now. I need you in the house." "Amelia, I can still—" "William?" She put herself directly in front of him. "Your boys are getting the cattle. Danny's handling the yard. I need someone in that house with Samuel, and I need it to be you." She held his gaze steady. "I know you want to be the one doing everything. I know that's how you've survived. But right now, you need to trust your sons to do their job, and you need to let me do mine. Can you do that?" He looked at her, looked at the sky, looked back at her. "Yeah," he said, rough. "Yeah, I can do that." She got him to the house, and she got his shoulder looked at. The joint was intact, but the muscle had wrenched badly, and she got him settled at the kitchen table, where Samuel immediately climbed into the chair beside him and pressed against his father's good side. She saw William's face change when the little body came against him, saw the arm come around, automatically pulling the boy in. Then she went back out. The storm hit full about 40 minutes later. It came down like something with a grudge wind that leaned on everything. Rain that moved horizontal lightning that split the sky every few minutes and left the thunder rolling over the mountains for what felt like forever. She was in the barn when James and Ethan and Caleb came back with the cattle. They were soaked through and the horses were blowing hard, and all three of them were exactly what she'd thought they were. Exactly the men their circumstances had forced them to become competent and grim and unbreakable in the way of people who had no choice about it. "All 30, James called over the wind. "All 30 are in." "Good," she said. "Get in the barn. Stay here till it passes. The house." Ethan started. "Your father and Samuel are in the house. They're all right. I'm going back." She looked at all three of them in the half-light of the barn with the storm roaring outside. Soaked, cold, steady as stone. "You did a good thing today," she said. "All three of you. You did a real good thing." She ran back to the house through the worst of it, and she didn't think about how wet she was, or how hard the wind was hitting, or how the yard had turned to rivers under her feet. She thought about a family she'd known for 6 days. She thought about whether the roof was sound over the kitchen. She thought about a little boy's hand around his father's and a 16-year-old's split knuckles, and the way a man had said, "I want you to stay," as plainly as if he were stating the weather. She got inside. William looked up from the table when she came in. Samuel was asleep against his shoulder, dead out the way small children went, completely without warning. William's good hand was around the boy's back, keeping him upright. "Everyone's all right," William said. "Everyone's all right," she said. "All 30 cattle are in. The boys are in the barn. The barn is sound." He let out a breath that was 3 years of something in one exhale. She sat down across from him at the table in her soaked dress, with her hair down around her face, and she didn't care about any of it. "You handled all of that," he said. "You were here 5 days, and you pay." "The boys handled it," she said. "I just told them what to do." "That's not nothing," he said. "That's—" He stopped. "Martha handled things like that. She knew how to, she always knew what needed doing before it needed doing. I thought when she was gone, I'd never—" He stopped again. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't." "Don't apologize for talking about her," Amelia said firm. "Don't ever apologize for that. She is their mother, and she is part of this house, and I will not be a woman who makes you pretend she didn't exist." Something moved hard in William's face. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. I think she would have liked you very much." Outside, the storm was still howling. Inside, the lamp held. And Samuel Hayes slept against his father's shoulder, safe and warm, while the woman who had come 300 miles on a bad promise sat across the table and held the whole thing together the way she had from the first morning, not by force or by volume, but by simply refusing in every single moment it presented itself to leave. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked like it had been wrung out and left to dry. William's shoulder was worse than the night before. That was the way of muscle injuries, always lying about their severity, until the next morning showed the truth of them. He came into the kitchen, moving stiff and careful. His right arm held close to his side, and he sat down at the table without argument, when Amelia pointed at the chair, which told her how bad it actually was. A man like William Hayes didn't sit when he was told without a fight, unless the pain had already won. She put coffee in front of him and made him hold a cloth wrung in cold water against the shoulder, while she got breakfast started, and neither of them spoke about it. They'd developed a language in the past week that had very few words in it, a language of proximity and small gestures, and the kind of silence that meant we understand each other, which was a more intimate language than most people ever built. The boys came in from the barn in stages. James first, then Ethan and Caleb together, then Danny, with Samuel on his heels. They were all moving a little slower than usual, the way of people who'd come through something hard and were still carrying the weight of it in their bodies. But they sat down, all of them at the full table without being asked. That alone was different from 9 days ago. 9 days ago, those chairs had been against the wall. "The north fence is down in 2 sections, James said, wrapping his hands around his mug. "I walked it before I came in. The cattle are still where they should be. They didn't test the wire last night, but it needs fixing today before they do." "Your father's shoulder," Amelia said. James looked at William, assessed it in the way he'd learned to assess everything fast practical, without sentiment. "Ethan and I can do the fence," he said. "Caleb can handle the morning feeding." "I'll help with the fence," Caleb said. "You'll help with the feeding," James said in the tone that ended arguments. Caleb opened his mouth, and then for the first time in Amelia's experience, closed it again without firing back. She noted that, filed it. "Danny," Amelia said, "how's the garden after last night?" "2 of the rows got churned up," he said. "The east side held better. I think if we reset the churned rows this morning before the ground sets, we won't lose much." She nodded. "You and Samuel take the garden after breakfast." Samuel sat up very straight at being assigned a task alongside Danny. He'd been doing that all week, tracking which jobs the older boys had and calibrating himself against them, the constant, quiet arithmetic of a youngest child, measuring the distance between himself and competence. "Samuel," Amelia said, "you remember what I taught you about telling the seedlings from the weeds? The seedlings got 2 smooth leaves and the weeds got the hairy ones," he said immediately. "That's right," she said. "You're in charge of identification. Danny does the resetting. You tell him which ones stay." Samuel's chest expanded about 3 inches. William was watching all of this from behind his coffee cup. He'd been watching her run his household for over a week now, and she felt his attention on her. The way you felt, sun on your back, warm and directional, pointed at something specific. When she caught his eye, he looked away, not embarrassed exactly, but careful. Like a man who was feeling something he hadn't given himself permission to feel yet, and was trying to behave until he got the permission sorted. She let him sort it. After breakfast, after the boys had scattered to their work, she sat across from him with the letter she'd been composing since before dawn and pushed it across the table. "I need you to read this before I send it," she said. He set down his coffee and picked it up. Read it slow, the way he did everything with his whole attention. His eyes moved down the page and she watched his expression shift as he read. The slight tightening at the mention of Garrett. The stillness when he hit the part about the railroad survey. The thing that crossed his face at the last paragraph which she'd written 3 times and still wasn't sure she'd gotten right. He set it down. "You're writing to the Territorial Land Commissioner," he said. "Yes." "Not the county assessor, the commissioner. The county assessor works inside the same system Garrett has been operating in," she said. "I don't know who he's bought and who he hasn't, but the Territorial Commissioner reports to the federal office and Garrett's reach doesn't go that far. Not yet." She paused. The letter cites the inflated tax documentation, the pattern of acquisition, the Walkers, the Buckleys, potentially others, and requests a federal review of land patent disputes in this county going back 6 years. Judge Hollis has already agreed to co-sign it. William looked at her for a long moment. "You went back to see Hollis," he said. "Yesterday morning," she said, "while you were in the barn." "You rode to Millerton by yourself," he said. "I've been riding by myself since I was 12, she said. He was quiet. "Then, how long have you been planning this?" "Since I read the Garrett invoice," she said. "I just needed the storm to pass before I could move on it." He looked at the letter again, then at her. "Amelia," he said slow, "if you send this letter and Garrett finds out—" "He'll find out," she said. "That's all right. I want him to find out." William went still. "You want him to—" "A man like Garrett moves in the dark," she said. "He spent 6 years working in the space between what's legal and what people can prove. He needs people not to look too closely. The moment you shine a light on what he's doing, really shine it federally, he stops being dangerous and starts being a man with a paper trail." She looked at William steadily. "I want him to know I sent it. I want him to know exactly what we've done. Because the worst thing that can happen to Franklin Garrett is for someone to be unafraid of him." William Hayes sat back in his chair and looked at his wife the way a man looks at something that has revealed itself to be larger than its container. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My mother's landlord tried to take our house when she got sick the first time," Amelia said. "I was 19. I went to the county courthouse with her lease and her payment records, and I sat across from a man twice my age who looked at me exactly the way most men look at me, and I put 17 months of receipts on his desk in order, and I told him I'd be at the next town council meeting with copies." She met his eyes. "He never bothered us again." The kitchen was very quiet. "I didn't know that," William said. "You've known me 9 days, she said. He nodded, slowly absorbing that, and she saw him doing the thing she'd watched him do all week, recalibrating. Updating the map. He was a man who, once he'd decided something was true, held it hard. That made him slow to trust. It also meant that once he'd updated, the update was permanent. She'd seen him do it with the ranch the morning after the storm. He'd walked the property differently, with his eyes open to what it needed rather than closed against what he'd failed. He was doing it with her now, seeing her more clearly, adjusting to the size of what was actually there. "Sign it with me," she said. He looked at the letter. "Hollis is co-signing," she said. "Tom Haller's wife's cousin is signing as the surveyor of record. If you sign too as the landowner, as the man Garrett has been directly targeting, it's not a complaint anymore. It's a case." He picked up the pen she'd laid beside the letter. He signed it. She sealed the envelope and set it to go out with the next postwriter, and they went back to the morning's work, and neither of them said anything more about Franklin Garrett for 3 days. Those 3 days were the quietest the Hayes Ranch had been since Amelia arrived. but it was a different kind of quiet from the one she'd walked into. The first quiet had been the quiet of people who had stopped talking because talking meant feeling, and feeling meant loss. This quiet was the quiet of people doing work side by side, which was an entirely different animal. James's hand healed. Caleb helped with the fence without being asked twice. Ethan took it upon himself to repair a section of the barn roof he'd been eyeing, and she heard him up there one morning before breakfast, working with a persistence that was pure James inherited from the brother who'd raised him as much as from the father, who hadn't had it in him those last 3 years. Danny talked more. Not a lot. Danny would never be a loud person. She understood that now. But he talked. He told her things about the property she wouldn't have known to ask, where the groundwater ran sweetest, which section of fence the deer used to cross, where his mother had planted flowers the first year, and they'd come up wild ever since. He told her these things in his careful, quiet way, and she listened to all of them, and she understood that he was giving her the place, handing it to her piece by piece, the way you handed something precious to someone you'd decided could be trusted with it. Samuel's hand healed clean. The day she cut the last of the bandaging away and showed him the new pink skin underneath, he studied it with the seriousness of a scholar examining a rare document. "It's different," he said. "It'll be like that for a while," she said. "Then it'll look almost the same as before. The body's pretty good at coming back from things." He thought about that. "Like us," he said. She looked at him. "Like your family coming back," he said, very matter-of-fact. "That's what James said. He said we're coming back." Something caught in her throat. "James said that," she said. "At breakfast," Samuel said. "When he thought I was still outside. He told Ethan we were coming back, and it was because of you." He looked up at her. "Are we—" "You are," she said. "You absolutely are." It was on the 4th day after the storm, 12 days in total, since the stagecoach, that the second letter came from Garrett. James brought it in from the post and held it out to Amelia with the expression he used for things he'd already assessed as threats. She opened it at the kitchen table with William sitting across from her and James leaning against the wall behind her, and read it twice before she said anything. "He's accelerating," she said. "What does it say?" William said. "He's claiming the dispute filing with the county is itself a breach of the original tax agreement, which it isn't. There's no such provision, he's inventing it, and he's moved the deadline from 30 days to 15. She set the letter down. "He's rattled." "Rattled men do stupid things," James said from the wall. "Yes," Amelia said. "They do." "What do we do?" William said. "We send a copy of this letter to Judge Hollis today," Amelia said, "along with a note from you pointing out that he's attempted to alter the terms of a dispute currently under federal review, which is a thing you are not permitted to do." She paused. "And then we do nothing. We don't respond to him. We don't engage with any rider he sends. If he comes here himself, you call me and we speak to him together." "You think he'll come himself?" William said. "I think he might," she said. "When the paperwork stops working, men like Garrett like to look you in the eye, see if they can frighten you in person." She looked at William steadily. "He's going to find out that strategy doesn't work very well on this household." William looked at her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a ghost of a smile this time, closer to the real thing. "No," he said. "I reckon it doesn't." Garrett came himself 2 days later. He rode in at 10 in the morning with 2 men behind him, not the rider who'd come during the storm. 2 different ones, both larger, both the kind of hired muscle that wasn't really muscle at all, but was meant to look like it. And he tied his horse at the front of the house and knocked on the door like a man who owned the place already. Amelia answered it. She had known he was coming since the sound of the horses, and she'd sent Samuel to the back of the house and told Danny to stay in the kitchen and not come out. And she'd let James and Ethan and Caleb continue with their work in the barn, because the best thing the boys could do right now was be visibly calmly occupied. An occupied family was not a frightened family. She'd opened the front door before Garrett finished knocking. He looked at her. She'd been told her whole life that her size was a weakness. She had come to understand over the years that people who believed that had made a very convenient error. When you were big in a doorway, you filled it completely. She filled it completely. Garrett recovered fast. He was practiced at recovering fast, and he produced his smile. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "is your husband available?" "He's working," she said. "I'm available." A beat. "I have a business matter for Mr. Hayes." "Then I'll take your message," she said pleasantly. "I handle the business matters for this household." She watched that land, watched him recalculate. "Perhaps we could step inside," he said. "I'm fine here," she said. Behind her she heard William's boot on the floorboard. He'd come down the hall without her calling him, which meant he'd been close enough to hear the horses and had made his own decision. He stepped up beside her in the doorway, and she felt the shift in the air when he appeared the way Garrett's two men straightened unconsciously. "Garrett," William said, "level, flat as a county road." "Flat as." "Hayes," Garrett said. He looked between them. "I came to give you an opportunity, a final one. I understand you've been in contact with some county officials about the parcel matter." He paused. "That's your right. But I want you to understand that legal proceedings take a long time, and in the meantime your family is dealing with the uncertainty of—" "Mr. Garrett," Amelia said. He stopped. "We've submitted a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Helena," she said, "citing falsified tax assessments on your invoices, a pattern of predatory land acquisition, targeting grieving families in this county over 6 years, and the specific attempted intimidation of this household by a rider identified as in your employ." She kept her voice even polite the way you spoke at a church social. "Judge Hollis has co-signed the complaint. The county surveyor's office has provided documentation of the rate discrepancy. And I have written statements from 2 additional families in this county regarding similar approaches made to them under similar circumstances." She tilted her head. "The commissioner's office has acknowledged receipt. That means there is now a federal record of this complaint and of you standing on our porch today." Garrett's smile had not moved. That was impressive, actually. She'd watched men crack faster. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she said. "It's been a productive 2 weeks." "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and now the pleasant tone had a thin edge under it. "You are new to this county. You don't understand how things work here." "I understand how things work everywhere," she said. "A man finds a family that's down. He moves on them with numbers that look real, and deadlines that feel urgent, and an implied threat that's sitting very quietly in the 2 large gentlemen behind you. He applies enough pressure to make signing seem easier than fighting." She paused. "It's a very old business model, Mr. Garrett. It works because most people are too tired and too broken to push back." She held his gaze. "We are not too tired. And we are not too broken." For the first time something moved behind Garrett's eyes that was not calculation. Something smaller. Something that knew when it had been read correctly and didn't like it. "The railroad survey," he said quietly. Not a statement, a probe. Seeing how much she knew. "The Northern Route Survey," she confirmed, "which is still active as of the last commissioner report, making the north parcel worth considerably more than its grazing value." She smiled at him the same way he'd been smiling at her. "I can see how that would be worth the effort of 6 years' work. I genuinely can. It was a good plan, Mr. Garrett. It just ran into an unexpected variable." "And what variable was that?" he said. "Me," she said. He looked at her. He looked at William beside her. He looked at the barn where 3 of the boys were working visibly calmly without stopping. He looked back at Amelia, and she saw the thing she'd been watching for the moment, when a man who has been applying pressure to a door realizes the door is not going to open. "This isn't over," he said. "It may not be," she agreed. "But the terms of it have changed, and I think you know that." She paused. "Have a safe ride back to town, Mr. Garrett." She closed the door. Not hard, not with triumph, evenly the way you closed a door on a finished conversation. Behind her, William exhaled. She turned and looked at him. His face was something she hadn't seen on it yet. Not just relief, not just respect. something that had been arriving by degrees for 2 weeks and had finally come all the way in. He looked at her the way you looked at a person you'd finally seen the full size of, and the size was larger than you'd imagined, and instead of frightening you, it made you feel for the first time in a long time that you might be standing somewhere solid. "Amelia," he said. "He'll likely make one more move," she said. "Through the courts or through the county office. But every move he makes now is on a lit stage. Every move creates more record." She looked toward the window where Garrett's horse could be heard moving back down the approach at a quicker pace than it had arrived. "He spent 6 years working in the dark. He won't survive the light as well." "Amelia," William said again, and his voice was different this time. She turned back to him fully. He was standing in this hallway with his good shoulder against the wall, and his injured arm still held careful, and he was looking at her with an expression that had none of his usual careful removal in it. No distance, no management. Just a man standing in his own hallway, having just watched someone fight for him the way he hadn't known anyone would fight for him again. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "When you first came," he said slowly, "when I turned my back on you in that street, I need you to know that I have thought about that every day since. What I did, what it must have." He stopped, started again. "You had come 300 miles, and you were standing in the dust with everything you owned in one hand and that letter in the other, and I turned my back." His jaw tightened. "I want you to know I am ashamed of that. I will be ashamed of it for the rest of my life." Amelia looked at him for a moment. "You were a man who had given up," she said. "I understood that when I saw it. I wasn't angry at you, William. I was sorry for you. There's a difference." She paused. "And you turned back around." He looked at her. "You turned back around," she said again, quieter. "When Samuel called for you. You turned back around and you looked at me, and you didn't send me away. That's the part I remember." She held his gaze. "That's what matters." William pushed off the wall. He crossed the hallway to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her, closer than he'd stood to her before, and she could see every line of what 3 years of grief and hard work had done to his face, and she could see underneath it what had been there before and what was coming back. He reached out with his good hand, and he took her hand. Not a gesture, not a politeness. He just took it and held it the way you held something you didn't intend to put back down. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know I've got 6 boys and a broken ranch and about 3 years of myself I'll never get back. I know what I'm offering is it isn't much." "William," she said. "I'm trying to say something," he said, almost rough. "I know," she said. "But I rode 300 miles for what you're offering, and I'd do it again, so I need you to stop apologizing for it." He looked at her. "I am not here because there was nowhere else to go," she said. "I am here because your son wrote a letter with his father's hand, and it reached me, and I came, and I walked into this house, and I knew in the first 10 minutes that this was where I was supposed to be." She turned her hand in his and held it back. "That's not something I need you to earn, William. It's already true." He stood there looking at her. This woman who had come from nothing to this in 2 weeks, and she watched everything that had been sealed up in him for 3 winters come to the surface at once. Grief and relief, and something new that didn't have a name yet, but would eventually, given time and suppers and storms, and the slow, ordinary accumulation of days spent in the same house as someone who had decided absolutely and without conditions to stay. "I should have said this sooner," he said. "You said it now," she said. "That's fine." He was still holding her hand when the kitchen door opened and Samuel came at a trot down the hall, having decided he'd been in the back of the house quite long enough and stopped dead when he saw them. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at his father's face. He looked at Amelia. "Did the bad man leave?" he asked. "He left," Amelia said. Samuel considered this. "Is he coming back?" "Maybe," Amelia said. "But he's going to find it a lot harder than he thought." Samuel chewed on that. Then he came the rest of the way down the hall and positioned himself between them, in the way small children did not, asking, just occupying the space, as if it had always been his, pressing against his father's side, and reaching up to put his good hand in Amelia's. Nobody said anything about it. William looked down at his youngest son, and then across at his wife, and the thing on his face was so unguarded and so raw that Amelia had to look at the floor for a moment to give him the privacy of it. James came in from the barn 20 minutes later and stopped in the kitchen doorway, reading the room the way he always did. Amelia was at the stove. Samuel was at the table. William was sitting with his shoulder eased out of its careful hold for the first time in days, a cup of coffee in his hand, not staring at nothing. James looked at his father. William looked back at his son. "He's gone," James said. "He's gone," William said. James nodded, hung up his hat, sat down at the table. And then he said, without looking at either of them, in the tone of a man closing a long account, "I wrote the letter Pa, the one to the agency. I forged your hand. I've been meaning to tell you, and I kept not finding the right time." He looked up. "There wasn't a right time. So I'm telling you now." The kitchen went completely still. William looked at his oldest son. James looked back, braced, all 16 years of him locked up and waiting for the verdict. William was quiet for a long moment that stretched the way long moments do when everyone in the room is holding their breath. Then he said, "I know." James blinked. "I figured it out about day 3, William said. "Your pen pressure's different from mine. Always has been." He paused. "I should have written that letter myself 2 years ago. That's the truth of it. You did what I should have done." James stared at his father. Something crossed his face that was the dismantling of something very old, a bracing he'd built so long ago he'd stopped knowing it was there. His shoulders came down, his jaw came loose. Just slightly. Just enough. "You're not angry," James said. "I'm not angry," William said. "I'm grateful." He held his son's gaze. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to be someone you didn't have to do that for." The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia kept her eyes on the stove because some things needed to happen without an audience, even when you were standing in the same room. "It's all right, Pa," James said, rough. "It ain't really," William said. "But we're getting there." And James Hayes, 16 years old, the boy who had held the whole fragile, broken structure of his family together by sheer will for 2 years, the boy who had forged a letter out of love and stayed ashamed of it ever since James Hayes let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said, "we are." Outside, the last of the storm had cleared completely. The sky above Montana was the particular clear blue that only came after hard weather, the blue of something washed. The kind of sky that didn't make any promises about what came next, but offered quietly the fact of its own brightness. Inside the Hayes kitchen, Amelia put supper on the table. The boys came in one by one and sat down. All the chairs. All 7 of them. William said grace. He wasn't rough with it this time. He still didn't have all the words, maybe he never would, but he had enough of them. And he said them in a voice that no longer sounded like something broken trying to hold itself together. He sounded like a man at his own table. Like a man who had finally come home to a place that against every odd and every failure and every turning of his back on something that refused to leave, had waited for him. 3 weeks after the storm, the letter from Helena arrived. James brought it in from the post the same way he'd brought in the Garrett letter, 2 hands' eyes already reading the return address. But this time, he came through the door fast, and he didn't bother taking his boots off first. "Amelia," he said. She was at the stove, and she turned at the tone of it because James Hayes did not use that tone for small things. He held out the envelope, and she took it, and she read the return address, and set the spoon down on the counter. She opened it at the table with William beside her, and all 5 older boys standing around them in a loose half-circle. Samuel wedged in at the front, because he was smallest and had learned to claim the front early. She read it through once without speaking. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table. "The Commissioner's office has opened a formal review," she said. "All of Garrett's land acquisitions in this county going back 6 years. The north parcel is under a federal hold. He cannot touch, it cannot file on it, cannot approach it legally until the review is complete." She paused. "And the review is expected to take 18 months. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ethan said, 18 months. 18 months, Amelia confirmed. He's done. Caleb said flat and certain, the way Caleb said everything now, still blunt, but aimed in the right direction. He's not done, Amelia said. Men like Garrett don't finish easily, but his play on this land is finished. And when the review finds what I think it's going to find about the Walker acquisition and the Buckley parcel, he's going to have considerably bigger problems than us. She looked up at William. William was reading the letter himself, moving through it line by line with his full attention, and she watched his face do the same thing it had done in Collins's office in Millerton, that slow tectonic recalibration, the adjusting to a reality in which he was not in fact a man who deserved to lose everything. He looked up from the page. His eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen yet. Not wet, just lit, like something behind them had come back on after a long outage. Martha's father filed that claim in 1864, he said quietly. Worked that land for 8 years before he passed it to her. She grew up on it. He set the letter down carefully. It stays. It stays, Amelia said. James released a breath through his nose that was 2 years of held weight leaving at once. Ethan grabbed Caleb's shoulder, and Caleb let him, which was its own small miracle. Danny in his quiet way simply nodded like a man confirming something he'd calculated would come true, and was satisfied to see the math bear out. Samuel looked up at Amelia. Does this mean the bad man can't take our cows? He said. That's exactly what it means, she said. He considered this with great seriousness. Good, he said, because I like our cows. The laugh that moved through the kitchen was real and loose and unguarded, the kind that couldn't be performed, or forced, the kind that only happened in rooms where people had finally stopped bracing. William was still looking at Amelia when the laughter settled. I need to show you something, he said. He said it quietly enough that it was only for her, and he got up from the table and she followed him out of the kitchen and down the short hall, and he stopped in front of the mantel. The picture that had been lying face down since before she arrived was still face down. She'd never touched it. She'd understood from the first day that it wasn't hers to touch. William reached out and picked it up. He held it for a moment, not showing it to her, yet just holding it. She could see his thumb moving across the frame in a small repetitive gesture, the way hands moved when they were doing something the heart had been avoiding. Then he turned it around. It was a woman. Dark-haired, slight, with the kind of face that had been pretty in a pointed, serious way. She was standing in front of the barn, the same barn younger before the roof section fell, and she had one hand raised against the sun, and she was squinting and almost smiling, caught between dignity and laughter. And even in a photograph you could see she had been the kind of woman who filled a room with intention. Martha, Amelia said. Martha, William confirmed. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, at the woman who had built this house's warmth, whose loss had nearly taken it entirely, at the mother of 6 boys who had all learned in their different ways to carry the shape of her absence. She was beautiful, Amelia said. She was, William said. She was also the most stubborn woman I ever knew. He paused. Until recently. Amelia looked at him. There it was, the real smile. Not the ghost of one. Not the almost. The real thing arrived at last, worn and careful and entirely genuine, and it changed his face so completely that she understood for the first time what he must have looked like before grief got into him. I'm going to put her back up, he said. If that's all right with you. I should have done it a long time ago. The boys need to see her. It's more than all right, Amelia said. She belongs on that wall. This is her home, too. He set the photograph back on the mantel, upright facing the room. And then he stood there looking at it for a moment, and Amelia stood beside him, and there was nothing strange or sad about it. There was room. There was enough room in this house for a woman who was gone, and a woman who had come for grief, and for beginning, for what had been, and what was being built. That was something she hadn't known for certain until this moment, that there was room. "William," she said. I'd like to plant flowers in the East Garden. Danny told me Martha planted some there the first year, and they've been coming up wild ever since. I'd like to keep them and plant more around them." She paused. "If that's all right." He turned and looked at her. "She would have liked that," he said. "I know," Amelia said. "That's why I asked." He reached out, not for her hand this time, but for her face. One rough-palmed hand against her cheek, the gesture of a man who had spent a long time not knowing who to reach for, and had finally, with great care and great cost, decided. "Thank you," he said. Not for the letter, not for Garrett. For something larger that neither of them had a word for yet. "You're welcome," she said. Behind them from the kitchen, they heard Samuel's voice announce loudly that he was hungry and that breakfast felt like it had been a very long time ago, and Caleb's voice telling him it had been 40 minutes, and Ethan's voice telling Caleb to be kind, and James's voice cutting across all three of them with a tone so purely accidentally parental that it made Amelia close her eyes and breathe. William dropped his hand. "We should go back in," he said. "We should," she said. They went back in. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Amelia had never been a woman who mistook progress for completion, and she was not about to start. Garrett filed one more counter-motion through a county circuit that Hollis shut down in 2 days. William's shoulder healed slow, and he pushed it too fast, which she told him, and he ignored, which told her something about him she already knew. James and Caleb had 3 more arguments, 2 of which were about nothing, and 1 of which was about something real that they needed the other 2 to be about first. Danny had bad nights, sometimes quiet and unreachable, and she learned to leave the lamp on in the kitchen on those nights so he knew without being told that someone was awake if he needed them. These were not failures. They were the texture of a real life being lived. She planted the East Garden on a Tuesday in late September, with Samuel beside her doing identification, and Danny doing the resetting, and Ethan holding the seed packets because he'd asked to help, and she'd put him to work without ceremony. She put the wild returning flowers Martha had planted at the center, and she planted new ones around them, and when Samuel asked why she was leaving the old ones in the middle instead of pulling them out, she said, "Because they belong there. They were here first. The new ones grow around them." Samuel looked at the arrangement with great seriousness and then said, "Like us." And Amelia said, "Exactly like us." And let that be the end of it. The morning it happened, the morning everything shifted. The last distance it needed to shift began like every other morning had begun for 6 weeks. Before dawn. Coffee, the stove. But this morning when she came into the kitchen, she found she was not the first one up. William was already there, not in his chair, not waiting for coffee. He was at the stove with his back to her, working the iron with the deliberateness of a man attempting something he hadn't done in a long time, and was determined to do right. There was a bowl of beaten eggs on the counter beside him, and the smell of butter heating in the pan. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and turned. "I watched you do it enough," he said, a little defensive, a little self-conscious. "I figured I knew how." She looked at the pan, at the eggs, at this man standing at his own stove for the first time in God knows how many years trying to make her breakfast. "You're burning the butter," she said. "I know," he said. "I was about to fix it." She came in and stood beside him, and she didn't take over. She just stood there while he fixed the butter and poured the eggs and moved them the wrong way twice before she put her hand over his on the pan handle and showed him once and then took her hand back. He got it. They were on the table, imperfect, a little brown on one side, but real, actually cooked by his actual hand. When the boys came down, and the look on James's face when he saw his father at the stove, was something Amelia committed to memory and kept. James sat down and looked at the eggs, and looked at his father and said nothing, because James Hayes had learned that some things didn't need words. He just picked up his fork. The others came in. 6 boys at a full table, same as every morning now, different from every morning before 6 weeks ago. William sat down. He looked at Amelia across the table. "I think it's my turn to say grace," he said. Nobody argued. He folded his hands, and the boys folded theirs, and Amelia folded hers. And he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was putting words together from somewhere deep. "Lord," he said, "I've been saying thank you for a while now, and I mean it more every time. I'm grateful for this table, and the people at it, and for the fact that—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "For the fact that someone came here who didn't have to, who could have left, and didn't." He cleared his throat. "And I'm asking you to help me be the kind of man who deserves that, every day, for the rest of my life." He paused. "Amen." "Amen," said 6 boys. "Amen," said Amelia. She pressed her lips together and looked at her plate, and the tin cup on the kitchen windowsill with Martha's wildflower still in it caught the morning light, and everything in the kitchen was warm and ordinary and exactly precisely where it was supposed to be. After breakfast, when the boys had scattered to their morning work, James stopped at the kitchen door on his way out. He looked at Amelia. She looked back at him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said. He was quiet for a moment. James never asked things impulsively. He brought questions up from somewhere, considered, turned them over first, made sure they were what he actually meant. "When I wrote that letter," he said, "the one to the agency, I wrote down what we needed. I wrote that we needed someone patient, someone strong, someone who wouldn't run." He looked at her directly. "How did they find you so fast, the agency? Ma'am told me later they sometimes take months to match." "They matched me in 3 days," Amelia said. "How?" James said. She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think when James asked her something real. "I think," she said slowly, "that when somebody writes what they actually need instead of what they think they're supposed to want, it narrows the field considerably." She looked at him. "Most letters ask for young or pretty or accomplished. Your letter asked for strong." She paused. "There aren't as many of us who get put in that pile." James looked at her. "I'm glad you were in it," he said. She held his gaze. "So am I, James." He put his hat on and went out, and the door swung closed behind him, and Amelia stood in the kitchen with her hands around her coffee cup and listened to the sounds of the ranch in the morning boots on the barn floor, cattle in the pen, the rhythmic sound of Ethan on the roof section he'd been working on all week, Danny and Samuel's voices in the garden, Caleb calling something across the yard to his brother, the sounds of a working place, the sounds of people who had stopped surviving and started living. She was still standing there when William came up behind her and stopped close, not touching, just present, in the way he'd started being present, consciously, deliberately, the way a man chose to occupy space beside someone, rather than just finding himself there. "Haller's wife is coming over Thursday," he said. "She wants to talk to you about what you found in the county records. Seems there are 3 other families who've had dealings with Garrett, and she wants to organize something." "Good," Amelia said. "She's bringing her cousin," he said. "The surveyor from Helena. Apparently she wants to meet the woman who read a tax ledger at 40 paces. Amelia laughed, a real one, short and unguarded. "It was a table," she said, "and it took 40 minutes. "That's not how Collins is telling it in town," William said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn and look at him. He was almost smiling, but underneath the almost smile was something serious and steady. "They're talking about you in town," he said. "The women especially." He paused. "You know what they're saying?" "I can guess," she said. "They're saying there's a woman out at the Hayes place," he said, "who came from nothing and took on Garrett with a ledger book and a borrowed pen and didn't blink." He held her gaze. "They're saying William Hayes didn't know what he was getting when he sent for a wife." He paused. "They're right about that part." She looked at him. "I didn't send for you," he said quietly. "My son did, because he was braver than his father." He reached out and took her hand the same way he had in the hallway, the same grip, like something he wasn't going to set down. "But I'm the one who gets to keep you, and I know that, and I don't intend to take it lightly. Not for a single day." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, Samuel's voice rose in a shout of satisfaction. He'd clearly found the right weed or the right seedling, something he'd been looking for. And Danny's calm reply floated in through the window. And somewhere across the yard, Caleb was laughing at something Ethan had said or done, and it was all so ordinary and so full that it pressed against the inside of Amelia's chest like a hand pushing something back into place. She thought about Missouri, about selling the last pieces of what her mother had left, and climbing onto a train with a carpet bag and a folded letter. About standing in the dust of Cold Creek while a town laughed and a man turned his back. About a 5-year-old with a burned hand held behind his back. She had come here with nothing. She was standing in a kitchen that was hers beside a man who had chosen her out loud, surrounded by the sound of 6 boys who had stopped bracing for loss and started expecting warmth. And none of it had been given to her. She had built every inch of it, in 6 weeks. 1 meal one morning, 1 honest conversation at a time. She looked at William. "Don't take it lightly," she said. "And I won't either. That's the whole deal." "That's the whole deal," he agreed. He lifted her hand and held it for a moment and then let it go because breakfast needed clearing and the day needed doing. And that was the thing about a real life. It didn't pause for its own beauty. It just kept moving and asked you to move with it. She cleared the table. He went out to his ranch. His sons worked the land their grandfather had claimed, and their mother had loved, and their father had nearly lost, and their hearts had nearly lost with it. And Amelia Carter Hayes stood at the kitchen window and looked out at all of it, the garden with Martha's wildflowers at the center, the barn with its new roof section solid against the sky, the 6 figures moving through the morning with purpose and ease. And she felt for the first time in a life that had asked a great deal of her that she was not preparing for something, not surviving toward something better, not enduring in the hope that the world would eventually decide she deserved more than it had given her. She was already there. This was it. This was the thing she had been strong enough to walk 300 miles toward, not a man, not a house, not a rescue from a life that had worn her down. A table with enough chairs, a family that had been breaking and had stopped. A place where the word stay was not a compromise, but a choice made every morning with full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave back. She had been sent away to marry a stranger with 6 sons. What she had found was a home that had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to build it from the inside out, and a family that once shown what warmth felt like had turned toward it the way every living thing turned toward light. Not because she had saved them, not because she had swept in and fixed what was broken, but because she had stayed. She had stayed, and she had meant it, and the meaning of it had changed everything. That was the truth of Amelia Carter Hayes. And it was the truth of every woman who had ever been looked at and found lacking by people who never once bothered to look inside. The world would always have its Garrett's men who circled the vulnerable and called it business, who mistook exhaustion for weakness and grief for surrender. The world would always have its boardwalks full of people who laughed at what they didn't understand. But the world also had women like Amelia, women who showed up with nothing and built something that lasted. Women who read every line. Women who, when a 5-year-old held up a burned hand in a stranger's yard, sat down in the dirt beside him without being asked, and said, "You are not too broken. You are not too broken. Nothing here is too broken." And then proved it, every single day, for the rest of their lives.